Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a study that in which I measured digital vocabulary learning, and I was looking at both vocabulary learning gains and also students' capacity for self-regulation on an English pre-sessional course. Before I describe the study, just a bit of background to justify why I focused on these two areas. So firstly, in terms of vocabulary goals, there are some important numbers that we need to be aware of. The first number is 3,000. So generally, it's recognized that students need to know a minimum of 3,000 most frequent word families in English in order to gain a 95% text coverage of most written texts. It doesn't mean that they understand 95% of the text, but they should recognize about 95% of the words in that text. Schmidt and his colleagues, they did a study that correlated vocabulary knowledge and reading comprehension. And they found that a 95% knowledge of 90% of the words in a text led to 60% comprehension. And overall, they found a remarkably consistent linear relationship between growing vocabulary knowledge and growing reading comprehension. And then finally, I did a study with a colleague a few years ago, and we found in my context that only 14% of students had knowledge of the first 3,000 most frequent word families. The majority only had a knowledge of 2,000 word families. So there's a clear gap between what the literature recommends in terms of word knowledge and the reality of students who are exiting an English foundation program. Why is this important for this conference? Because generally, if students don't have enough vocabulary, they're going to find it a real challenge to read and understand the academic texts that they have to cope with on their degree courses if they're studying through the medium of English. The second aspect that I looked at was self-regulation. There's a couple of definitions there. So Zinnerman, who's one of the leading educational psychologists in this area, he describes it as the self-directive processes and self-beliefs that enable learners to transform their mental abilities, such as verbal aptitude, into academic performance skill. And it's also the process by which people attempt to constrain unwanted urges in order to gain control of the incipient response. Why is this an important concept in second language learning and vocabulary learning? Well, firstly, it's a vital concept for informal learning outside the classroom, where the students do not have access to a teacher directly. So they need to be able to self-regulate their learning. It's also been identified as a key concept in L2 learning in general by Rebecca Oxford. And Seng and Schmidt have identified it as a key aspect of vocabulary learning as well. And then finally, with technology and the widespread use of smartphones in particular, there's also a need for self-regulation for students to control their use of devices, and also in the light of phenomena such as nomophobia or fear of being without your smartphone, which can obviously impact learning. So Seng and Schmidt, they devised a model of motivated vocabulary learning in which they identified self-regulating capacity in vocabulary learning as one of the key concepts. And this was statistically tested as well. They found that self-regulation wasn't directly linked to vocabulary knowledge, but it was mediated through strategic vocabulary learning involvement. You can see SVLI, and also mastery of vocabulary learning tactics, MVLT. But actually in their study, they didn't specifically test the relationship between self-regulation and vocabulary knowledge. So that was something that I wanted to try and do as well. So these were my research questions. So research question 1, what are the effects of using a digital vocabulary learning tool on students' receptive English vocabulary knowledge? particularly in terms of reading. The second question was similar in terms of the effects of using digital vocabulary learning tool, but on students' capacity for self-regulated vocabulary learning through technology. And the third question was about the relationship between those two variables, and also the number of completed digital activities. So very briefly, the research design, this was a naturalistic case study. And what I'm presenting here is part of a wider mixed methods study. The context was a higher education institute in the UAE based on 2 campuses, particularly focusing on an EAP pre-sessional course designed for students of an IELTS level between 4.5 and 5. And on this course, we had just over 500 students. So I managed to get 246 of these students as the participants in the study. 94% were female, and students were aged between 17 and 19. Based on the previous research, I hypothesized that their average vocabulary size is about 2,000 word families, although obviously I didn't directly test this particular group of students. And the design is very much a pre and post testing of vocabulary knowledge and self-regulated learning. And then in between the pre and post, there was an intervention where students were presented with learning materials on Quizlet, and they were 50 sets of 10 words. And these were based on a word list of 500 restricted word families. And the intervention was an out-of-class independent learning activity for students. It wasn't done directly in class. And I should say this was also a curriculum requirement. So all the students in the program were doing this. So just briefly, a couple of points about the research instruments. So the first one was the number of Quizlet activities. So colleagues who were teaching each of these courses collated the number of activities that each student was using on Quizlet. The second tool was a meaning recall vocabulary test, which I devised. It was based on a sample of the 500 words on the word list. And it basically tested students' ability to show their knowledge of the meaning of these words from the orthographic form or the written form of the word. And then finally, I used a published survey tool, the self-regulated learning for vocabulary through ICT survey tool. And this is made up of 23 statements, and each statement, students respond to it on a 6-point Likert scale. So this survey tool basically looks at 5 dimensions of self-regulation. So you can see number 1, commitment control, number 2, metacognitive control, affective control, resource control, and social control. So the findings, so research question 1, overall, the average increase of students' receptive vocabulary knowledge based on the vocabulary test was 40%. They went from knowing or demonstrating knowledge of the meaning of about 46 words in the pre-test to 64 in the post-test, so about a 40% increase. 89% of students saw an increase in their vocabulary scores in the test. And overall, we can extrapolate that the average learning gains were about 90 words over the 10-week intervention period. However, of course, if they already only knew 2,000 words, they're still nowhere near learning the 3,000 word families that have been identified as a minimum requirement. Having said that, it's interesting to compare my study to 2 previous studies that were also conducted in a similar context to mine. So Davison and et al., they saw learning gains of about 56 words over a shorter period. and Watts identified learning gains of about 80 words over 16 weeks. So to make that comparable, in the final column, you can see that the average learning gains per week were higher in this study than the two previous studies. And interestingly, those two studies were done through paper-based learning materials, whereas mine was obviously through technology, through Quizlet. In terms of self-regulated vocabulary learning through technology, there was actually no change in the students' overall capacity. So the average score for each statement, bearing in mind a maximum of 6, the average score was 4.57, and that changed very little from the pre-test to the post-test. There were, however, as you can see in the table, a couple of small changes in commitment control and social control. So commitment control actually fell slightly, whereas social control actually rose. And the social control difference was actually statistically significant. And if we compare that with previous studies, so if we said that in my study, the average SLR score for students was about 4.6, we can see in other previous studies, the scores were actually lower. So for example, Lion Gu, they did a study in Hong Kong. Again, that was a technology-based survey, and their score, the average score for Hong Kong students was 4.2. And then two other studies, Centerk in Turkey, the average score was lower, 3.8, and Mizumoto and Takuchi in Japan, their score was even lower, 3.2. So it's interesting here that technology, the survey that was based on learning through technology actually ended up with higher scores than the non-technology survey. And then finally, just to enable the relationship correlations to be shown in a minute, we also, as I mentioned, measured the number of digital vocabulary learning activities that students completed. So they were doing 50 sets of vocabulary, and in Quizlet, you may know there are 7 different activity types. So over the 10-week period, the maximum possible was 350. The actual reality was the mean number of activities was 210, 21 a week, or 4.2 per set. So I think this was evidence that students were actually engaging with the learning activities on Quizlet. And then finally, the relationship between variables. There were no statistically significant correlations between vocabulary knowledge and self-regulated learning. And similarly between the vocabulary knowledge and number of completed Quizlet activities. So that was in terms of their pre-test score, their post-test score, and also the change in their vocabulary knowledge. So there was no relationship there. However, there was a statistically significant correlation with a small effect size between the number of completed Quizlet activities and 3 dimensions of self-regulated learning: the commitment, metacognitive, and affective self-regulation. So conclusions and implications. Firstly, in terms of using a digital vocabulary learning tool, my study did show that there were greater learning gains using a digital vocabulary learning tool than from using paper-based materials in similar contexts. However, the vocabulary knowledge that students developed was still well short of the ideal level. In terms of the capacity for self-regulated vocabulary learning, there was a higher capacity than in other countries and in non-technology contexts. But because the score did not change, I suggest it does suggest the need for students to have awareness raising and training and self-regulation. Because there was no direct relationship between vocabulary learning and SLR, I would suggest that this supports Tseng and Schmidt's model of motivated vocabulary learning, and the effects of self-regulated learning are mediated through mastery of vocabulary learning tactics. And then finally, this study, in addition, helped to show the reliability of the survey tool that was previously developed. The mean scale coefficient was 0.91, which was very, very reliable. A couple of limitations and suggestions for future research. So the vocabulary test, the fact that students already knew on average 46% of the words does suggest there was a need for more diagnostic testing to revise the word list and make the word learning more targeted. I did only test vocabulary breadth, not depth, and receptive knowledge, not productive knowledge. So that could be another avenue for future research. In terms of capacity for self-regulated vocabulary learning, I only measured the students' own perceptions based on the survey. So it would be interesting to actually observe their behavior. And then finally, I only measured the total number of Quizlet activities. It would be interesting to measure the individual activity types used by students. So thank you very much for listening.